Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first lesson in Unit 3, asking ourselves, who is God? In order to talk about who God is, I'd like to spend a little bit of time developing some vocabulary that we'll be using. Some of these words you might be familiar with, some of them you may not be. So if you could have your notes out, ready to record down these vocabulary terms, that'll help us in our conversation about defining God going forward. The first word I'd like to talk about is this understanding of monotheism. Monotheism is a belief in only one supreme God, that there is only one God. Mono is the prefix meaning one. Maybe you can think of some other words that begin with M-O-N-O that mean one, like monologue is just when one person is talking. And then theism should look familiar to us, as we've talked about theos, meaning God. So belief in one God, monotheism. There are three major world religions that are monotheistic, meaning major world religions that believe in only one God. They are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There may be other monotheistic religions out there, but the major world religions with major populations are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Polytheism, on the other hand, is a belief in many gods. The prefix poly, meaning many. Maybe in your math class at some point you've talked about a polygon being a many-sided figure. So polytheism is a belief in many gods. Deism is a belief that there was a God and that God created everything, but that's all that God did. That God is not involved in our day-to-day life, but rather he just kind of created us and then walked away. A lot of times deists refer to God as a watchmaker. Once somebody makes a watch and kind of spins it and sets it in motion, then they don't come back to it. They don't, they're not involved in the life of the watch anymore. And so a deist would believe that God created the world at some point, but is no longer around, essentially. That would be a deist point of view. Whereas a monotheist or a polytheist would believe that God or gods is active in our lives today. Some other terms that might be helpful in talking about views of God. One is atheism. Atheism is a denial of the existence of God. The prefix a means no or not or negates. And so anonymous, for example, is without a name, right? And so atheism is a denial that God exists, that the feeling that there's no way that there could be any form of God or gods. Whereas an agnostic would believe that there's no way to know for sure if God exists. The prefix a, no, but then the root word gnosis, which means knowledge. So essentially no knowledge. There's no way for us to know if God exists, is the opinion of an agnostic, where an atheist would outright deny the existence of God. An agnostic would say that there's no way for us to know. But what I say is that usually in practice, agnosticism resembles atheism. And what I mean by that is that both an atheist and an agnostic and how they're going to live their life is going to look very similar. Neither will spend time worshiping God, will belong to any particular religion or anything like that. They will, because one believes there is no God and one believes that there's no way to know, so why would I spend time with something that might not exist? Neither would spend time in worship. Okay. Another word that will be helpful for us is to talk about secularism, or a secular world, a separation of kind of matters of the state or the government or kind of regular life, separation of that from religious life or religious ideas or religious institutions. For some of you that went to public school before you came to FIAN, you might be familiar with that concept. In a public school, you would not be praying outwardly like we do here at this Catholic school, because a public school is a secular institution. It's an institution where there's a separation of public things and religious things. So for those of you who have experience in a public school, you've experienced kind of a secular institution. Okay. In order to talk about who God is and how God works and operates, it's important for us to also talk about some of the ideas that might be out there that might prevent us from seeing God as God truly is. And so it's important for us to talk about kind of some misconceptions maybe about God. And maybe if we debunk some of these misconceptions, some of the issues, not all of them, that we brought up yesterday, some of the obstacles to faith, we might be able to answer or to take on. So the first way I want to talk about, or misconception I want to talk about God, is this idea that God is somehow a superhuman. In the Greek and Roman times, they often like to think of their gods as just being like really, really strong, really, really powerful human beings. And human beings that had tempers and that wanted revenge and that all of that kind of stuff. But as we, as in the Christian tradition, understand God, God can't be boxed in to be thought about as just a human being, with all of human beings' flaws and limitations, and even the fact that we're limited by a body. Even if they were a really, really strong body, like you can see in the picture here of Poseidon with his Ripley muscles and things like that, he's still limited to, if he's got a body, he can only be in one place at once. God can be everywhere at once. And so God is not just a really, really strong, really, really powerful human being. He's something bigger than that. So we kind of have to stretch our minds a little bit to think about God not looking like a person, and that God isn't a person, but is something bigger than that. Okay. Another kind of misconception can be that God is like Santa Claus. If you think about it when you were little, maybe your experience was, or somebody you know, you go to the mall and you sit on Santa's lap and you ask for a particular present, and then on December 25th, the present is right there under the tree. And I think a lot of times we can think that God works that way, that when we pray for something in the timetable that we understand and that we know, we're going to get exactly what we ask for. And that isn't necessarily the case with God. And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be and how that might be going forward. But it can be harmful to think about God as Santa Claus, who just kind of brings us exactly what we ask for, because it can limit what we understand God to be able to do to our imagination. If God can only do what we can imagine for our lives, then God might have even bigger and better plans for us that we might be missing out on. Also, God does not exist as part of our natural world and isn't limited to our natural laws. And so a lot of times, I think for some reason, one reason that a lot of you spoke about faith as believing without evidence is sometimes we think evidence means being able to put it in a scientific lab, look at it under a microscope, and believe that it's true, see it with our own eyes. And for God, that doesn't work because God isn't a part of our natural world. That's a great way to learn about our natural world, but because God created our natural world, God is not a part of that. And so learning about and studying and finding evidence for God is going to look a little bit different than finding evidence about our natural world that we would do in a science class. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means going forward too. Okay, so understanding that God is beyond what, kind of the small things that we can imagine God looking like. God is being itself, is not just a being, is not just a person, but is beyond the world because God created the world. It's going to be an important understanding that we're going to move forward from to try to really define who God is and what God can do in a way that might be bigger and might be different from what we're familiar with. Okay, so this is going to be the end of our presentation. Next, I'm going to ask you to please work on the work that I've asked you to do in our Catholic faith, and make sure, please, that you take the Google form, check for understanding, to see how well you absorbed some of the things that we talked about in this presentation today and some of the things that you read in our Catholic faith as well. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you on Monday.